righty. Hello, everyone. My name is Jillian Cobb, and I am the Public Programs Producer here at the National Nordic Museum. I want to thank you so much for joining us today for today's virtual Meet the Author, Afro-Sweden, Becoming Black in a Colorblind Country. This program features author Ryan Thomas Skinner and is moderated by Ethelene Whitmire. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce them today. So our author, Ryan Skinner, is an associate professor of music and African American and African Studies at The Ohio State University. He is a musical anthropologist who studies the expressive cultures and social worlds of contemporary Africa and its European diaspora, with extensive fieldwork conducted in Mali and Sweden. Skinner's scholarship has appeared in such journals as Scandinavian Studies, African and Black Diaspora, Africa Today, Research in African Literatures, and many more. Our moderator today is Ethelene Whitmire, Chair and Professor of the Department of African American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Whitmire is a Fulbright Scholar and was a visiting professor at the University of Copenhagen Center for Transnational American Studies in 2016 through 2017. She has received additional fellowships from the American Scandinavian Foundation and the Lois Roth Endowment. Her current book projects are The Remarkable Life of Reed Pegram and Searching for Utopia, African Americans in 20th Century Denmark. She is the author of Regina Anderson Andrews, Harlem Renaissance Librarian. At the end of today's talk, we will leave some room for questions. We'll have about a 15-minute Q&A. So we ask that you post your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will get to as many questions as possible, so feel free to write them in as soon as you think of them. So I will now pass it over to Ethelene to take it from here.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending this great seminar about this fantastic book. Can't wait to get into it. So I'll turn it over to you, Ryan, so that you can give us an overview of the book and talk about some of the key words.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, first off, to the Nordic Museum for making this event possible. It's really an honor to join your community today, albeit virtually. Next time we'll do this in person. And to Ethelene Whitmire, it's such an honor to be in conversation with Ethelene. We met a few years ago in Tampere, Finland, where we were both participating in a conference on Afro-European studies. And so this is a nice reunion moment for the two of us. And I think the conversation will be quite rich across these two projects that deal with the African diasporas in Denmark and Sweden. I'm going to say a few words about the book and introduce some of the ideas that animate the book, and then share some music and images with you, just to get a taste of some of the things I'm thinking about and writing about in this text. Afro-Sweden, Becoming Black in a Colorblind Country, is about Afro-Swedes. It's about people of African descent in Sweden. It's about their stories and their strivings, their art, their politics, their language and social life, and their vision for a Sweden that makes space for their presence, past, present, and future. I'm an ethnographer by training, which means I tell stories about the human condition, about community, culture, and society, what these social formations mean in different places, to different people, and at different times, and why they matter. My book is a collection of such stories about the social history and public culture of Sweden's Black and African diaspora. The book is organized into 6 chapters and divided into 2 parts, which present 2 central themes in the study: remembering and Renaissance. Remembering is a concept rooted in social history. 3 chapters, or the 3 chapters in part 1, emerge from oral history interviews, targeted archival inquiries, and open-ended dialogue about the Afro-Swedish past, both recent and deep. As a concept, remembering describes recollecting the past as a socially constituted practice. In other words, remembering invokes a common history to foster a sense of community. Remembering is a deeply human practice, signaling the way we anchor and situate ourselves in time. But for migrant, exiled, or otherwise dispersed populations, that is, for diasporas, there is a particular urgency to the ingathering of history to reconstitute the social. By way of comparison, an excellent example of diasporic remembering is Johanna Rubin Drenger's recently published graphic novel, Ihåg oss till liv, Remember Us to Life, which beautifully narrates and illustrates her Jewish family's fragmented and fraught history across generations in Sweden, Scandinavia, and Europe. Another recent example is Mats Jonsson's När vi var samer, When We Were Sami, also a graphic novel in which the author tells of his effort to reconnect with an indigenous Sami heritage, disrupted, dispersed, and nearly destroyed by Swedish colonialism. A good example of Afro-Swedish remembering comes from a book which came out earlier this year, so it doesn't appear in my book, in 2022, Amit Levin's Svart Historia, Black History, a book that episodically charts significant moments in African and Afro-diasporic history in Swedish for a principally Swedish readership. The book is intended to fill gaps in the historical record, which in Sweden as elsewhere often elides or obscures Africa and its diaspora. For Levin, an Afro-Swedish journalist, to remember Black history is to remember, that is re-member, diasporic community. Renaissance, in my book, refers to generative moments of creative vitality and social possibility. It describes periods of cultural genesis and imagination and reimagination, when communities become critically and consciously aware of themselves. While the term may signal for some Europe in its modern history, for example, the Italian or Dutch Renaissance and their ideas and expressions, my points of reference are drawn from the Black and African world, from places like Harlem and Chicago, Paris and Dakar, Lagos and Johannesburg, sites where the African diaspora has coalesced as a transnational community through novel social and cultural movements and expressions, and through histories that challenge us to think about Renaissance in broader comparative terms. In my book, I make the case for a specifically Afro-Swedish Renaissance in the present, focusing on innovative practices in language, politics, and the performing, visual, and literary arts. To exemplify the art of Afro-Swedish Renaissance, I invite us to consider the music and visual culture of Sinabusi. Born to a Gambian father and a Swedish mother, raised in the southern Swedish town of Halmstad and the sprawling Gambian capital, Banjul, Sinabusi is an internationally acclaimed singer and songwriter performing in the popular Afro-diasporic idioms of soul and R&B. Describing C's music in chapter 6, I write, quote, quoting myself, "Critics rave about her distinctive soul pop style, a mix of the singer's studious attention to the vocal currents of the Black Atlantic and the remarkable pop alchemy perfected by Swedish musicophiles like Magnus Lidehäll, who produced and co-wrote the tracks on C's first LP. More subtly, one might hear the influences of her late father, Maudu C, a Gambian band leader who performed an eclectic mix of mbalak, reggae, and West African funk until his untimely death in 2013. For the younger C, this diverse sonic pastiche achieves a distinctive and generative consonance, both musical and social. That is, her hybrid, genre-defying soul pop resonates to the tune of her multiply conscious personhood as a Gambian, a Swede, an artist, and a woman.
Oh, that's great. I love that music. Thank
too.
you for sharing. So I tried to anticipate questions that the audience might have. And the most basic one is, what got you interested in this research to begin with?
Yeah, that's a great question. What got me interested, I'll begin with the most immediate and obvious, which is the Afro-Swedish community. During the time when this research was being conducted, and this is roughly from 2013 to 2018, there was just a lot happening, an extraordinary amount of what I call public culture, expressive culture, theater, dance, music, visual art, but also politics, activities within civil society. I was astounded by the engagement and expressive vitality of this community. So that's sort of the first and most immediate answer to that question. A slightly different answer to that question takes us back about 20 years. When I first started asking questions that resembled what this project would look like. I was living in Sweden. I was a middle school teacher. I had lived in West Africa. I played the kora, which is a 21-stringed harp, and I was very active within the Senegalese, Gambian, and Malian and Guinean communities in Stockholm as a musician. And as I was beginning to think about going to grad school, I started to craft an idea about a project that dealt with African musicians and in Sweden, and their presentation as being principally as an exotic other on Swedish stages, despite the fact that they were living in Sweden and were in many ways Swedes, but treated as an immigrant or as a foreigner in that country, which many of them were, but their identities were much more complicated than that, and certainly woven into the fabric of contemporary Sweden. When I presented that project to my graduate advisor, he said, and this is a self-consciously critical statement about the discipline of ethnomusicology. He said that if I were to get a job within ethnomusicology, I would have to choose a project that was significantly foreign or exotic, again, using those kind of ideas, which is to say he encouraged me to go back to Africa and conduct a research project that began from an African center rather than from its diaspora, because at the time, 20 years ago, ethnomusicology was not as robustly engaged with transnational diasporic topics as it is today, I think. So I did a project which became my first book about post-colonial history and popular music in Mali, but came back to this project 10 or so years later, around 2012, 2013. And when I came back, I met up and was involved with some of the people that I had known 10, 11, 12 years prior. But I was also coming into contact with a new generation of Afro-Swedes, and they were calling themselves by that name. They were entirely uninterested in the notion that they might be immigrants in their own society, foreign to their own society. And they were expressing themselves as Black and Africans in Sweden, as an articulated consciousness, as Afro-Swedish. And that's really the genesis of this particular book. So the kinds of questions that animated that initial project are still there in many ways, but they're infused, I think, with the spirit and urgency of this more contemporary generation of Swedes of African descent who are posing, I think, more urgent questions about their identities in the present.
That's great. Could you talk about who are the Afro-Swedes? I'm sure people want to know how many are there? I get that question too about Denmark. And then you started the book with this wonderful anecdote with Trevor Noah joking about, I'm not actually into rap, so is it ASAP Rocky or ASAP Rocky?
ASAP Rocky, yeah.
ASAP Rocky's arrest and how he doesn't need to be in prison because it's easy to find a Black person in Sweden, as almost as a joke perhaps, but you said that just shows that a lot of people don't think there are a lot of Black people in Sweden. So who are the Afro-Swedes? How many? Can you tell us a little bit?
Yeah, no disrespect or and all love to Trevor Noah. I love his work, but a progressive South African comedian in the United States is essentially making a joke that there are no Black people in Sweden. That's the butt of that joke. Just let ASAP Rocky out of jail. He's not going to go anywhere. And the screen flashes during that particular Daily Show episode to a group of white people. This is Sweden. And I begin with that quote because it shows just how little we know about Sweden's diversity. Sort of a quarter of its population are, according to statistical models that Sweden keeps, foreign born. That's the way that difference is measured in Swedish national statistics. And about a fifth of the Swedish population is non-white, people of color. And I estimate, and here I'm working with scholars like Michael McKeechrane and Tobias Hübinette, who have also kind of wrestled with the Swedish Statistics Sweden, sort of the National Center of Statistics in Sweden, to estimate the number of people of African descent specifically in Sweden. And I would guess that that's around 500,000 people. That's a guess because those statistics, again, they point you towards country of origin, where people come from, and that's how difference is defined in terms of ethnic and national terms. And so you really have to do a lot of gymnastics to even begin to estimate what a Black population might be, or what a population of African descent might be, including people of Caribbean descent, for example, a more broadly Afro-European population, people coming from the United States, and these are sort of ethnically and racially complex societies. So country of origin doesn't tell you much. So, but that's a long way of saying that my best estimate currently is about 500,000 people, and that is it might very well be quite conservative. So Sweden is a very diverse place. It has a robust and vital population of African descent. And that needs to be acknowledged. Now, who are the Afro-Swedes? That's a somewhat different question. Another thing that we don't see in Swedish national statistics is self-identification. So how do people identify themselves? And were you to pose that question, I'm sure you'd get fascinating results just based on the way communities are socially constructing themselves on their own terms in Sweden. And with the community of African descent, we see people identifying in these terms as Afro-Swedish, Afro-Svensk, as African-Swedish, Afrikaans-Svensk, as svart, black, or even using the English term, black. And these terms broadly constitute, in a very kind of general way, a sense of being black and African in the world, rooted in Sweden, but they also tell us something about how that blackness and Africanness is being understood. Afro-Swedish has a lineage that I think as a term connects to discourses about, say, Afro-German identity, Afro-Deutsch. It's a similar kind of term that comes out of the 1980s and 90s. African-Swedish, at least in the Swedish lexicon, is a more recent term that signals a specific connection to the African continent and a kind of pan-Africanism in terms of its the ways in which that identity is being imagined as a transnational community. To say you're svart or black, I think for many Afro-Swedes connects them specifically to an African-American discourse about being black in the world. So these terms they're connected, but they're not the same. And they register different ways of being black and African in Sweden today.
Thank you. Thank you for that. This book was wonderful. You call it an assemblage. Could you talk more about your research process? The amount of data you have is mind-boggling. Did you plan to do this over the many years? There's interviews, events that you attended. Clearly you speak Swedish too. Statistics, analyzing documentaries, TV shows, music. Yeah. What was your process?
Yeah. It was an incredible experience of gathering material, and like I said, right from the start of this conversation, what motivated me to do this project was the sheer amount of cultural and social productivity coming out of this community. And it became very clear to me as a card-carrying ethnomusicologist, that is an anthropologist of music, that this book couldn't just be a book about music. For the reason that music was not the only medium, was not the only mode that people were employing to express their sense of blackness and Africanness in Sweden. And many musicians were also employing modes that were outside of their box. So for example, Jason Timbuktu Jakite, a very famous hip hop artist from Sweden, wrote a memoir. So automatically his music is connected to literature, and that memoir became a stage play, first in Swedish, and then he took it on tour in English to Harlem, performed at the Harlem stage, and now the English version of the play is coming back to Sweden. So and this is happening with many of the people I'm working with. Senabusi is a musical artist, but she's very, very attentive to visual representation. So growing up, she told me in an interview, I didn't see people like myself in advertisements, in magazines, in the public sphere. It was as if we were invisible, right? And yet hyper visible. And so in her visual culture, in her music videos, she makes a real effort to foreground Black women. So her mode of identification is very much intersectional. She's thinking about what it means to be a Black woman in Sweden, and then to represent her particular Africanness. Many of her videos, like the one we watched, are set in the Gambia. And so that's a way for her to affirm her personal heritage and provenance, but also to connect with a broader cohort of Black women. Now I forgot where we began this question, but I hope I have, in a general sense, answered it.
Yeah, about your research process, but you can also tie it into some of your greatest challenges doing this kind of research. And you do talk about your position as a white American going into these different spaces. I notice you often will say, I'm not going to really comment on something that you saw, except for something about the Tarzan movie. You just said, oh, it was terrible. But other than that, sometimes you seem to step back. Is it because of that, or yeah?
Those are great questions. Yeah, you asked me about research. I'll say a few more words about that. and because it relates to the challenges as well. So when it became clear to me that this was going to be a work of cultural anthropology and that I was going to focus on music, but not exclusively, I really had to retool. I had to expand my toolkit. I was going to be writing about theater and literature, and I was going to be writing about topics that were outside of also sort of my core training as an Africanist, as a scholar of Africa, and a scholar of Africa's music. This is a project that's very much rooted in Black studies and Africana studies. I've had the privilege of working in a department of African-American and African studies for the past 12 years, and I have an enormous debt of gratitude to my colleagues for essentially training me in this field of Black studies that made this book possible in so many ways. It's also a work of Scandinavian studies, and I worked very hard over the past decade to integrate the knowledge and findings of that field into this book. And now I'm a card-carrying member of both the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora and of the Society for the Advancement of Scandinavian Studies as a result of this project. Challenges, and you're talking about my positionality in particular. For the most part, I didn't encounter that as a challenge in the research, because I made a choice very early on that this was going to be a book about public culture, about activities, events, discussions that were happening in civil society, in the public sphere. And so I'm not talking about what it means to be Black and African around the dinner table with folks talking among their families and their loved ones and their friends. Those stories do exist, and there are a number of excellent autobiographies that have come out. For example, Jason's book, which is now in English, A Drop of Midnight. I can't more highly recommend it. There you get a sense of the intimate experience of in Jason's case, being a person of mixed racial descent and growing up in Sweden. But those are not my stories to tell. And to the extent that they have appeared in publication, I do draw on those. But my book is rooted in a much more public world, where folks are discussing these ideas through their art, through their politics, to wider audiences. So there's that. In terms of the Tarzan, I try that's kind of a funny moment maybe in the book. I actually like Alexander Skarsgård very much as an actor, and that movie is very interesting. It's just not my cup of tea. The movie is as one Swedish commentator said, a politically correct Tarzan, in which Tarzan is called on to fight Belgian colonialism in the late 19th, 20th century Belgian colonialism. And it's a fascinating, piece of cinema, just not my cup of tea.
Fine. But you were able to get such great access and interview so many interesting people. It was really wonderful to read all of these, I guess you call them case studies or anecdotes. What surprised you the most in your during your research over the years?
So I guess I would begin again with the question of discipline. First, just the sheer sort of variety of expressive forms, and how that was manifesting across various sort of domains of experience. So there's a chapter that's all about words and sort of the linguistics of this, articulating Afro-Sweden, chapter 4. Politics, there's a whole chapter on the political experience and expressions within civil society, but also in the Swedish parliament, pertaining to the Black and African community, and then a robust field of artistic expression. So that's sort of a surprise that's pleasant, because there was a lot happening. Surprise also. This is a somewhat different approach to that question, but this book is about the fluorescence of a diaspora community in Sweden. It parallels the fluorescence of an increasingly successful ethnic nationalist political movement that animates its politics through conversations about national culture, but those conversations are often code words for an ethnic or racial sense of Swedish belonging that is implicitly, but also sometimes explicitly exclusionary of the kinds of people I'm working with in this text. There's a conversation now in the Swedish parliament about repatriation of foreign-born people in Sweden. The incidence of racial slurs and antagonism against people of color in Sweden is less taboo and more out in the open. And I think something that perhaps has surprised me is just the way these two things have paralleled each other, and in some ways have brought Sweden to an inflection point, which I think this book describes, but we're very much living that history. So where it goes is a much more open question.
Oh, how interesting. And this kind of ties into where I was going to go. I know you said the research ended in 2018. I'm assuming you're still involved with Sweden, even with the pandemic, and maybe you weren't able to go as much as you wanted to travel. But how has Black Lives Matter impacted Sweden? Because it seems like it's been an international movement, after 2020. Within your book, you sometimes cite incidents of violence against different people. Sometimes I will look it up. Sometimes I will find stuff. Sometimes I couldn't find much information about some of the incidents that you mentioned in the book. But what is your sense of, they might not call it Black Lives Matter movement, but the activism lately? Do you get a sense of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the book ends with an anecdote about an event that was organized by Black Lives Matter Sweden. So the first way of approaching that question is that the Black Lives Matter as an organizational or institutional presence is very much has a there's a chapter in Sweden, and people who are organizing in civil society under the rubric of Black Lives Matter. And they organized an event in June 2020 in Stockholm, but also throughout the country. And my epilogue addresses that specific event in Stockholm, which was online and was on archived on YouTube. And it's very interesting because many of the people involved in that event were making obviously explicit ties to the United States and the murder of George Floyd, for example, but also talking about the specificity of the way COVID at the time seemed to be and was disproportionately affecting Somali Swedes specifically, that there was a disproportionate incidence of COVID among Somali Swedes, and wanting to animate a conversation about why, what the potential intersection of race and class in that incidence, in the ways those things might be leading to higher rates of infection and mortality. That came up in that discussion, but also wanting to tell the specific story of anti-Black racism in Sweden and connecting it to the incidences and traumas and tragedies that were animating the Black Lives Movement elsewhere, and specifically in the United States. So it was a moment of diasporic connection and shared grief, I think. And the question is also asking about activism into the present. So for context, in late September, there was an election in Sweden. And in that election, a governing coalition emerged, and they just recently formed a government. So it took some time, about a month, I think. But it is a small group of three parties: the moderates, the liberals, and the Christian Democrats, who have formed a government. And together they have about 30% of the vote. But their government is made possible by another party, the Sweden Democrats, that won just over 20% of the vote. So altogether, they have a little over 50% of the vote, and it's an unprecedented turn toward a more populist, far right mode of governance, in which an animus toward foreign-born Swedes is palpable. So I think people within the Afro-Swedish community are understandably worried, concerned, and I think there's a lot of anxiety about what comes next. That said, recently in October, there were public celebrations to informally, because it's not a formal celebration, but honor the abolition of the slave trade in Sweden. Those events continue to happen. There are new works, books, works of art that are continuing to come out. Those types of things that I follow in this book have not been silenced, have not stopped. People remain active and activist in their own ways. But we're, like I said, at an inflection point, and it will be interesting to follow with some caution and concern what happens to Sweden as a multicultural, diverse society.
I was going to ask if you're still involved in the community and still follow, but clearly you do, what's going on in Sweden. Where do you think this book is going to take you, or where do you go next from this book? And also, do you plan to go to Sweden to talk about the book?
Well, I sure hope so. Yeah, some family background. My wife is Swedish. We speak Swedish with our kids. This is a very strongly American Swedish family here. So we do go back to Sweden every year if we can. COVID sort of put a wrench in that, but that is something we do. And when I do go back to Sweden, I do try to make contact with my academic colleagues and keep those conversations lively and active. And with this book, I do hope that there will be some interest from Sweden. It's still very early since its publication. So we'll see what kind of readership emerges in a Swedish context. I'm very curious at this point about what that Swedish readership will make of the text, but also excited to participate in these conversations. Like I said, this is a very important, anxious but important moment in Swedish history, and so I look forward to participating in the conversations that hopefully will allow us to see the near future with clearer eyes.
I agree, and I can't wait to see what the people who are here have. Oh, I actually know this person. A question from Lola. How far do you think Sweden's dialogue on race has come? A recent survey puts it at least 4 decades behind the United States. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sweden's discourse on race. One would begin that question by acknowledging that officially that discourse on race doesn't exist. By which I mean there's been a concerted effort over the past decade or more. Again, these are things that other scholars have charted. I'm thinking of Michael McEachran right now in a wonderful book on Afro-Nordic landscapes, and in which he explicitly studies the removal of race as a category from legislative and juridical documents. That is officially biases and practices that are racially motivated ought not to exist. That race is a biological concept is a flawed concept. This is emerging out of discourses following World War II, therefore it ought not to exist. So I'll start by simply saying that officially that discourse is moot. It doesn't exist. And so it is from civil society. It is among anti-racist activists. It is among in the case that I'm following here, people of African descent, Black and African Swedes, that this conversation is being generated. And like I said, going back 10 years to the beginning of this project, one of the things that motivated me was seeing so many people, young people in particular, insisting that Sweden have this conversation, because their experience as people of African descent in Sweden included regular forms of anti-Black racism. And so I would say perhaps behind other places in that regard, but it is interesting to me to see that generational turn that has perhaps, at least in a popular sense, within civil society and the public sphere, caught Sweden up to a conversation that they need to have in the present. And that's thanks to the African and Black community.
And she's part of that in Sweden. This is an anonymous attendee. Are there areas of Sweden, and I noticed you went all over, not just in Stockholm, that are more accepting of diversity, given your experience?
Yeah, it sort of depends on how diversity is defined. I think in general, it is hard to talk about race in Sweden. It's, again, for the reasons I described in the wake of World War II, but also specifically just as a matter of official discourse. It's hard to talk about race. You can talk about racism, and certainly there's a sense in which Sweden is anti-racist, or has been. It's a conversation that I think is going to change because of recent elections. But to talk about identities that emerge out of experiences of racism in everyday life, that is a Black identity that is about a common experience of anti-Black racism, but also identities that are forged around transnational coalitions that cannot be reduced to a nation or a single ethnicity, diasporic identities, because of the way those identities would appear too close to race. That those identities are also in many ways invisibilized in public discourse, and arguments about them have to be all the more vocal because they're met with, oh, well, that's just identity politics, and that's an imported notion from somewhere else. Oftentimes, the person in question is saying, this comes from the United States, and we don't need that here in Sweden. In Sweden, race doesn't exist. So it continues to be a struggle. So the question, though, was where in Sweden is it harder or easier? Sweden cannot be reduced to Stockholm, but certainly in Stockholm, these kinds of conversations are robust and plentiful. So in some ways, it might not be easier, but it's easier to talk in Stockholm because there are so many active folks within the community there, the African and Black community, but also just sort of, a population density that means there's just a lot happening, a lot of events, a lot of conversation around these topics. And that's, perhaps less the case in areas of Sweden that are less populated, but wherever I travel, I met Afro-Swedes, and I met communities that were engaged in various levels of life, people from all walks of life, up in Umeå, in Skellefteå in the north, down in Malmö and Lund and Lomma, and everywhere I've been in Göteborg, I have met Afro-Swedes and have had conversations about their lives. And so I don't think there's any place in Sweden where this is easy. And I do think it can the experience of racial difference in Sweden can vary from place to place. But I do want to insist that these folks are everywhere. And it is an experience that does transcend those kinds of regional boundaries.
Okay. And a kind of related question, I probably know the answer given what you just said, that someone asked about, does Sweden have something equivalent to affirmative action? Might have been asked by an American. I know you talk about housing issues, employment issues that a lot of the Afro-Swedes face.
That's an interesting question. I mean, the answer is with a direct comparison to American. This is what scholars Omi and Wienand would call a racial project. So affirmative action is a project that acknowledges a history of racial discrimination and attempts to redress the insult and injury of that history. There is nothing comparable in Sweden insofar as that history of racism and the experience of being racialized is not part of an official discourse in Sweden. In fact, very recently, even like I said, you could talk about racism, and there were projects on the government's website that dealt with the government's commitment to anti-racism. Those have been taken down. So one step forward, two steps back. There's nothing in an American sense equivalent to affirmative action in Sweden for the reasons I've described.
Okay. Yeah. Let me see. And again, feel free to put questions in the chat, people in the audience. Someone said, can you say anything about the other Scandinavian countries? I often get this too, even though I'm talking about Denmark. Though I must admit, a lot of your things that you talked about reminded me of Denmark in some ways. Some of the things that are happening in Sweden.
Yeah, and this might be unfair, but I'd love for you to take a moment, Ethelene, and talk a little bit about some of the resonances you felt. I mean, there's a moment in the book where I sit down with a group of 6 or 7 African Americans in Malmö, and a couple of them came over from Denmark. Malmö is right, just across the sound from Copenhagen there. And that's a moment, I think, in which the oral histories of our 2 projects are very much co-present. The specific conditions, I think, of the African diaspora in these countries do vary. For one thing, Sweden has had for many a laudably liberal approach to immigration, which has meant that a lot of people have found their way to Sweden and have made homes there from all over the world. But like I said, a population of upwards of 500,000 people of African descent in particular. So the population of Black and African Swedes is, I think, proportionally much larger than you find in, say, Denmark and Norway and Finland, where those policies have looked different over the course of the recent past, going back a couple of decades. Ethelene, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the resonances you felt with the African American story in Scandinavian?
It's just that my focus is really on history. I'm looking at African Americans in the 20th century, but I was very interested in Black people who are in Denmark. Some of them do identify as Afro-Danes. What's going on there? I actually went to a meeting when they had one of the leaders from the Black Lives Matter in the United States was in Denmark in 2017. It was just a packed audience, and there were different groups and organizations that wanted to come together. There's a whole flood of young activists. There's artists. There's a reckoning with Denmark's past with the slave trade. I was glad that I was there from 2016, 2017, and 2017 was when they had the 100th anniversary of the sale of the islands to the United States. And people took that opportunity to really talk more about what was going on with the slave trade, because a lot of people didn't know much about it. Now there's some monuments there, or there were some monuments in Denmark now to kind of commemorate these things. Yeah, I don't want to take away too much from your time, but it was just interesting about how do you define people. Some people have been there very long. Some people or several generations have been in Denmark, but still kind of feel as Afro-Danes that they're not part of the community or not accepted totally. There was a great little film that I show my students too. It's not a documentary, a feature film about a young Black woman who was adopted by a Danish family and her experiences in Denmark. People assuming she doesn't speak Danish, talking to her in English all of the time, and then not quite feeling in touch with her ethnic background. So I don't know, a lot of these things kind of resonated, but yet different. But then, as you also mentioned, there are some people, including African Americans in my study, who are also in Sweden, like Herb Gentry and Clifford Jackson. So a lot of people went in between the 2 countries. So right. I'm just glad that this work is out there. It's very inspiring because I'm overwhelmed with all the stuff that I've collected. And I was like, how do I put it together into a book? And I think you've done a great job by pulling this together in all of these different stories.
Yeah, so there are so many things I want to say about what you just said. First is I love this conversation. I really hope I look forward to seeing your work as it emerges on the African American history in Denmark. My hope is that this book will inspire more work, that we will see more studies of this Africana heritage in Scandinavia. I mean, you and I met in Finland, and so that's another place in the Nordic world where these issues are being actively debated and discussed in and out of the academy. I think I look forward, to kind of the emergence of, I don't know, could we call it Afro-Nordic or Afro-Scandinavian studies as a way of really kind of foregrounding the experience of Black and African people in Scandinavia. A note about that conversation I had in Malmö, it was so fascinating with these elders, in the African American elders in the community. I had come and I sent a list of questions to them beforehand, and I had a lot of questions. I got around to asking one, because it was so urgent for these folks to tell their story. And as soon as we got started, the stories came out about their lives, about their history, the high points, the low points, the run-ins with the police, their struggles getting an apartment contract, but also the homemaking, what Tina Compt calls diasporic homemaking, and coming together with other people of African descent and sharing, their life ways and experiences. And really, 4 hours, a beautiful 4 hours spent with these folks. But I literally asked one question, and that to me also spoke volumes, because as one of the community members told me, Marubuku Jakite, no one asks us this question. No one asks us these questions. There are too few people interested in their lives. So I got a lot of gratitude from that particular gathering, insofar as I was there to listen to them. And I sincerely hope that more folks, yourself, others, will take the time to hear their stories, because it is fascinating, and it is important. Another thing I would say about that conversation, which was interesting, is that, they said, I asked about what it meant to be an immigrant in Sweden, but I was thinking of it as more of an abstract concept, because they have lived in Sweden for 50 plus years.
Right.
And they said, man, we're going to die immigrants in this country. Our kids are immigrants, they would say. Our grandkids are immigrants. It's sort of a kind of stigma that is attached generationally to people, that says you will never really be a full member of this community. You might hold a passport, but your Swedishness will always be in question. Where do you really come from? Wow. Is a question that people encounter all the time. And so that for me was, you talked about being surprised. There were many moments where I was sort of floored.
Yeah.
And, where you sort of take a step back and say, wow, that this is a conversation, again, we need to have.
Yeah, and I saw that too. And one of the largest groups in my study are jazz musicians, African-American jazz musicians. And so I met with some of their offspring. And and you do see it, like this second generation, still not quite part of the society. Are there other questions? Unless I'm not refreshing in the right way. I was just trying to check to see if there were other questions people might have. Any burning last minute questions? And I should plug for the National Nordic Museum. I'm working with their staff on curating an exhibition for 2024 about African Americans in Scandinavia. So we're covering, or in the Nordic countries. So we're covering Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland. That's off in 2024. And so maybe we can continue having these kinds of conversations.
Yeah.
Oh,
looks
there
like
is
one question. Yeah.
Yeah. Sophia. The elders are not being asked questions because Swedes want them to blend in or hide, she's asking.
Yeah. I think what I got from that conversation is that people were simply not interested, or were unaware that the invisibility that people, I think people of color, non-white Swedes experience, but people of African descent specifically, is an invisibility that generates a kind of popular ignorance, that if the people don't exist, then there isn't a story to tell. I think that's changing. You mentioned musicians. There's a documentary now in Sweden about Amadou Jar, who's a very famous percussionist who is very active in multiple circles of what we would now call world music, but also jazz. There are, like I said, numerous autobiographies that are coming out. These stories are beginning to be told. They're being published and they're being documented. There's a film that I called Medan vi lever, While We Live, by a West African filmmaker living in Uppsala, Dani Kuyata. You asked about my next project. I'm working with Dani on a co-authored memoir or biography of his life and work. So these stories are beginning to be told, and interest is being taken in them. But the challenge to broadcast them, for those stories to reach a wider audience, continues to be difficult. And so that's the challenge moving forward, is to continue the conversation and to amplify those voices as much as possible.
What about the young Afro Swedes? Are they interested in talking to the older generation? I keep thinking of this documentary about Audre Lorde in Germany and how she asked, the young Black people to stay after a talk and to meet with another Black person in Germany, which a lot of them hadn't. And then they formed a whole Afro-German movement, and they started talking to the elders to find out about their experiences. Do you see any of this intergenerational?
I think the contemporary sort of figure that is comparable to Audre Lorde's presence in Germany going back 35 or so years is Angela Davis. Angela Davis has come to Sweden a few times, I think, and has given has made space for younger Afro-Swedes and African Swedes to converse about their experiences with her, and I think as a result have also taken an interest in histories that help them understand their condition and experience. And there are events like the Cinemafrica. It's the biggest African film festival in Scandinavia, and these kinds of questions have been posed in those contexts as well. There's a lot of historical work that's happening in film that these younger African and Afro Swedes are curating to open up those spaces of conversation, and that includes interaction and engagement with their elders.
Good. There's two other questions, or a few others. Lola asked about publishing. She has a book out, a novel about, she didn't say that, but I know, about Black women in Sweden. And someone else that you mentioned some other books today, or a list somewhere that people can get access. Well, a lot of the books were mentioned in your book too, right?
Well, the good news is, and my book is as an intellectual project, all publications are works in progress, but it does take, I think, the pulse of a moment in a discourse about these topics, and the book is freely available. It is freely available online. If you Google Manifold, MANIFOLD, Minnesota Afro-Sweden, it's the Manifold platform through the University of Minnesota Press. That is hosting my book online, and you can read it and annotate it, and it's a very clean and readable copy online. So you can go to the bibliography and explore these texts. I have done my best, at least up to 2021, when I had to sort of push this out to the press and say we're done, to ingather relevant material in Swedish and English. And I hope people can use that bibliography to explore other texts. And to those of you who may have published texts that I missed, I apologize, but I do hope that this can be a platform or foundation for further inquiry.
Definitely. Oh, there's so many questions that are coming in about other Swedes, like Asian, Arab backgrounds. I know I met a filmmaker from Malmo who was doing research about the man who was going around, or did a documentary who was targeting people of color in Malmo. So I think you hint at some of these things too, right, in your book.
There are scholars. Catherine Lundström has done work on Latin Swedes, Latinx Swedes. Tobias Hübinette is, I think, currently writing a book about Asian Swedes, which I have learned a lot from Tobias over the years, and I would preemptively recommend that text because I know it's going to be interesting. There are certainly, and I'm thinking about an organization in Malmö like Arabiska Teatern. So it's a theater that produces work in Arabic in Sweden. There's a lively publishing industry. A lot of Arabic texts in Arabic get published in Sweden in translation. So there is a comparable sort of what I'm calling a renaissance of Arabic language art. And so certainly another interesting, hopefully, outcome of a project like this is that we have more studies of other diaspora communities and how they themselves are identifying themselves in what terms, through what means. That would be fascinating to see develop.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, we have 2 minutes. I don't know if you can answer any of these questions. Can you see any of them? Political movement, the political movement towards the right, what are the specific concerns of Afro-Swedes? Touched on, yeah.
That's an evolving thing. That the election is so fresh. On the other hand, the emergence of that far right coalition has been a long time coming, and so I think the concerns of these communities is again to draw attention to the fact that this struggle is now a political struggle. It's not just a social struggle. That there are going to be struggles with the government itself. As I say in the epigraph to chapter 5, Paul Gilroy, the fight against racism will be a fight against the state or a struggle against the state. And I think the Afro-Swedes are going to see the state as a site of tension and struggle moving forward. I don't expect the civil society to sort of disappear, although I am concerned about civil society in general in Sweden. There's been notable sort of attacks on institutions. For example, an organization devoted to the protection of the natural world, of the environment, has been a target of critical interest for this government. So it's going to be it's not something I can comment on specifically, but I do firmly believe that this community will be active in whatever politics emerges from this moment.
Definitely. And Jillian, are you still there? Oh, here she is.
Yes, I'm still here. We are sadly out of time today. This has been such an amazing conversation. I think we've gotten through most of the questions. But I just want a huge thank you to both you, Ryan and Ethelene, for this conversation today. I know I learned a ton, and I expect that all of our visitors here have learned a ton too. Thank you for everyone who turned in questions. As a reminder, this is a recorded session, so this will be put up on our YouTube within the next few weeks, so you can go back and revisit it if you want to give it a second listen, jot down some more notes, things like that. But thank you all so much for your engagement today, and we look forward to seeing you at the museum very soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ryan. Excellent book.